do I think from an infectious disease perspective, it's actually safe to have washrooms, and in particular public washrooms, open. I go back to basics when I'm trying to figure my way through any infectious problem. And the back to basics part of this, and I recall the first conversations we had about this on the first webinars, and I'm not certain if there's anyone on here in general who would have been on the first ones, but we had 6 weeks of information about this virus. Unfortunately or fortunately, we now have 2.5 more months of information, a ton more infections, and unfortunately more deaths, but we know a lot more with some certainty about how this virus spreads. And the key to whether or not it's safe to be in a particular space depends on exactly how the virus is spread. And so if we take it from that perspective, we know that it's primarily a respiratory virus and primarily spread to a very, very large extent by droplets, those little particles of fluid that you produce when you cough, sneeze, and to a smaller extent, talk forcefully or sing, apparently, in some certain situations with great gusto, I'm sure only, not the lip service that I used to do to it in church choir because I was told not to sing very loud. But my point is droplets, and those droplets drop out of the air within 6 feet. They can land on things. The virus can exist outside a person, but it can't divide and replicate. And by that, I mean viruses need human cells in order to divide. So if you cough, sneeze, or end up having some of the droplets when you're infected land on a surface, they can exist there and somebody else could touch them and get them onto their hand, but that's not an infection per se, but they need to then get from said hands or your elbow or whatever else touches a high touch surface into your eyes, nose, or mouth in order for an infection to occur. There's been a great deal of discussion about the GI tract. Viruses like coronaviruses and many, many other viruses, big families called enteroviruses, they often get into the gastrointestinal tract. There are some similarities between the cells that line that tract and the upper respiratory tract in some parts of the body. But it doesn't seem to divide very well in those cells. And if it zips through from one end of the GI tract to the other, there is some evidence that the genetic footprint of that virus may be in the stool or some other, in urine on occasion. It may on very, very, very rare occasions be a wee bit infectious, but it is not super infectious when it comes out the other end. It's an enveloped virus. And just so that we're clear, we have not seen worldwide with 5.5 or more million, it's over 6 now, over 6 million infections around the world. We have not seen a signal from the epidemiology that suggests that this is spread and is entirely infectious from a GI perspective. Doesn't mean the virus can't be found there if you try really hard to look, but the main infectious route is respiratory and those droplets. And touching stuff that might have droplets, touching your face when you don't wash your hands. So it's a long preamble to answer a very short question to say, what is the importance of that? Well, it's important because when you go into a public washroom, you need to know how many other humans are around you that might have an infection. That's your first risk of infection, but that's not intrinsic to the washroom itself per se. You go into a washroom, it has 4 walls, hopefully some nice ventilation and some windows, beautiful hand washing stations, we're hoping, with lots of running water that flows fast. And what else would be useful is a sign that says, I was cleaned last on, and some evidence that there's actually cleaning materials around that can be used. I always think that's a bonus when there's actual cleaning materials somewhere nearby, because it reminds me that that washroom is being cleaned. So intrinsically, is there a reason why I should think that people should not use restrooms in public to avoid COVID-19 at the current situation, where virus levels are generally low in most communities? I don't think there is, if you're capable of washing your hands and not touching your face and you're able to go into a restroom that's cleaned well, and you have the ability to wash your hands, whether that's with an alcohol hand wash or running water. And if you're really uncomfortable about those aerosol generating toilet flushes, flip the lid down if one exists. And otherwise, if you can't flip a lid down because it doesn't exist and you're still really worried about those aerosols that are going to be generated from that toilet, step back as you flush the toilet and leave the cubicle fairly quickly. But I'm not worried as an infectious disease doctor overly about aerosols generated by toilet flushing. And the take-home message is, do I use public washrooms when I can find them? Yes, I do.
That's great. That's a pretty clear message. But I mean, it sounds like also that the advice that you're giving is the same advice as we would use at home in the washroom, at work in the washroom, or at public washrooms, right?
I hope
I sort
so.
of hope people are washing their hands at home as well, and maybe putting the lid down too.
Well, I think Leslie, you and I had this conversation. Someone else had asked me about the little pieces of paper in some restrooms. Germany's a big fan of these little pieces of paper that go over the toilet seats. Like, oh my gosh, it's the equivalent of people wearing gloves, which to me is another huge risk factor for spreading infection. What that does is that it has you touching surfaces that other people might touch more often, putting on these little paper protective covers for toilet seats. I don't do that. And it shouldn't be a big deal at this point to recognize that washing your hands and doing it properly, not taking the sneaky swipe under, doing this, and then taking them out with your thumbs unwashed, that's not the way to do it. If you wash your hands properly, this is not a risk, like you do at
Great.
home.